All right, we are recording. We are live.
Great, thank you. Good morning and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first Audit Committee meeting of 2022. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. Justin, can you please call the roll, please?
Sure. Broughton.
Here.
Chen.
Here.
Dellen.
Here.
Saleg. Don't see Sean. Shelby.
Present.
Tony.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Great, thank you. It's good to see everyone. I know we had thought that we would be together in person, but I hope that everyone is healthy on the other side of their computer. So next is the public comment. The State Bar staff will call members of the public in the order that they appear in the attendee pool. For those who are participating via Zoom video, you should have a function for virtually raising your hand. It is a hand icon and it should appear at the bottom of your screen. If you wish to address the committee, please click on the hand icon now. Do we have anyone for public comment? And I'm sorry, for those participating by telephone, you may virtually raise your hand by pressing *9.
I do not see anyone with a hand raised.
Excellent. That being said, let's wait one moment. Great. That being said, let's move to the chair's report. I have no report at this time, just very excited for the work of this committee to proceed and looking forward to what will transpire through the balance of this fiscal year. And again, excited to see everyone. First, then we will move to item 2, consent. There are 2 items on the consent agenda. Item A, open session minutes, and item B, approval of 2021. Do any of the committee members wish to pull any item from the consent agenda? If not, Justin, we can take both of these items simultaneously, correct? Or do we need to take it separately?
Correct, the consent calendar in one vote.
Perfect. May we get a motion for the approval of the consent calendar items?
I'll move the items.
Thank you.
Sonia, second.
Perfect. Moved by Broughton, second by Dellen. Please call the roll.
Broughton.
Yes.
Chen.
Yes.
Dellen.
Yes.
Saleg. Tony. Mark. Is Mark frozen?
No, he's on mute.
Sorry, aye.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about
It
that.
passes.
Oh, excellent. Items 3, presentation and discussion with Macias Gini and O'Connell regarding the 2021 Fiscal Audit and Schedule. And I believe that Aricela Montoya Chico, our CFO, is going to kick off this item. Good morning, David Bullock. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Thank you. Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Aricela.
Good morning, Shelby.
Please proceed.
Great. So just really quick before I introduce David, you know, the audit committee charter calls for the audit committee to oversee our external auditors, approve our the timing of our audit and all of the procedures that are to be performed. So that's what this presentation that David is about to give to us is for. There's required communications according to the auditing standards. So David will also cover those in here. And I'll hand it over to David.
Okay, great, thank you. May I share my screen? Would that be okay?
Please do.
Okay, great. It can be easier to follow along. So the first document, attachment A, and thank you all for for having me here at this meeting today. Let me introduce myself. David Bullock. I'm a partner at MGO, and we've been doing the audit for the past 4 years. And as you may be aware, the audit is something that's procured usually on about a 3 to 5 year basis. And so we're in year 4 of 5. And so we have a contract in place, but we also prepare an engagement letter. And so attachment A is our engagement letter that defines the scope of services that we perform for State Bar, and also responsibilities. And that's really the reason why we have to do this letter. We already have a contract in place, but that contract doesn't really specify the responsibilities of both State Bar and of the auditor. So that's why we have this letter, and it's something that we do on an annual basis, and it just defines the scope of the financial statements. We also audit the legal services trust, and we look at the mandatory fees. So that we have 3 deliverables that we produce as a result of this engagement. This next section talks about what the auditor's responsibilities are, and I'm going to get to that in the PowerPoint, which is laid out a little more easily than reading a bunch of paragraphs on a page, and then management's responsibilities. And so that's the purpose of that engagement letter, and that's why we do that, just to make sure that both parties understand responsibilities of the audit and the purpose of the audit. So I've put together a PowerPoint presentation today to share our responsibilities in terms of communications with you as the audit committee. And so you've had this in advance. I'm not sure if you had an opportunity to read it, but I know that there's a short period of time, so I don't want to use up all the time walking you through it, but rather just highlight it and then allow you any questions you might have, and we can expand on any topics that you'd like to discuss. The engagement team, I'm the partner on the engagement. I'm responsible for the delivery of service. I have a manager, Gian. She is the person that really is the key liaison between management of State Bar and us, and she's the one that helps me plan the audit and execute our audit plan procedures. Tina is our senior associate. She's all 3 of us are CPAs, so Tina's a CPA, and she'll be the person that's on site every day working with Araceli and her team. And just to take a step back, we're in a new age with this virtual work environment. And so when I say on site, I really mean dedicated to State Bar's audit. We perform a lot of our work remotely now, just due to the current environment, but we do have to do some procedures on site. State Bar does contain sensitive information that's considered confidential. And both of us, both MGO on our side and State Bar would prefer us be on site to inspect those documents and not put those in electronic format. So, but most of the audit is done remotely. I do have a secondary partner, Benjamin Lau. He's what we consider to be a technical review partner or a concurring partner. And we do that for quality control. So every report that goes out of MGO has been looked at by 2 partners, okay? And so that's just part of our own internal audit quality control. And then Linda Hurley and Andy are part of the team that help us on the technical side as it relates to the IT environment. So we bring in some IT specialists to come in and take a look at the finance system and other important IT systems, just to ensure that there's established appropriately, there's the appropriate security on those systems and whatnot. So, some of those IT related matters are a little beyond our accounting knowledge, and so we bring in IT experts to help us with the audit. So I just wanted to let you know who the team was. The next part here is the required communications, and this is what we're required to communicate as part of the planning. So we're right now in our planning stage. We have a contract in place, so we've already begun our audit, and we've done some preliminary work and looked at internal controls and have done other things to help us plan the audit, because you're a December year end and that year end is passed. But finance needs time to close the books. And so we're expecting to start the audit in March, giving finance team approximately 2 months to close the books. So this is still the planning stage, because we haven't really begun the audit until March. But in planning, we need to communicate our responsibilities, and that's what we're doing today, and the scope and timing of the audit. So that's what we're going to communicate today. Now, when the audit's done and we come back to this committee with the results of the audit, these other things will be communicated. We'll communicate the results of the audit. Obviously, the financial statements will be presented, but if we have any internal control deficiencies that we've identified, we'll report those matters to you. If there's any compliance related matters, we'll report those to you. And if we see anything, maybe best practices that we think would be an improvement to your financial statement preparation or internal controls, we'll communicate those matters. And then we'll communicate other things that came up during the audit. So these are the results, and these get communicated at the end. And so our mandated, or excuse me, the State Bar's mandated deadline for financial reporting is April 30th. So we'll be presenting, I believe, in May to this committee the results of the audit. And here's our responsibility. So we're expressing an opinion on the financial statements. So we want to ensure those financial statements are fairly stated, that there's no material misstatements. And so that's the purpose of the audit. We follow standards. We follow the AICPA standards on conducting an audit. And I believe we also follow government auditing standards. So we have two sets of standards that we follow, and the government auditing standards really incorporate the AICPA standards, but adds in additional requirements for how we communicate and on internal controls. Internal controls, we don't express an opinion on internal controls. So we don't tell you, your internal controls are operating properly, but we evaluate those internal controls to make sure we understand how financial information is recorded so that we can rely on that information. And there's some key internal controls at State Bar, such as, payroll, making sure that employees are paid the right amount, making sure that those are reported in the appropriate funds, and making sure that those obligations for pension and OPEB and other things are reported properly. So that's just an example of internal controls. And then findings. So we would communicate the results of our audit at the end. And this just is a visual, a chart that talks about the flow of the audit. So terms of the engagement are defined in the engagement letter. They're also defined in the audit contract. We gather information, we develop a strategy and plan the audit and develop an audit plan. That audit plan is executed once we start the audit in March, and then we form an opinion and we report. One thing I want to take just a quick time out and say materiality. We look at materiality both on a qualitative and a quantitative basis. And we do that because, we need to establish a threshold in which, things are considered material, and we're ensuring that these financial statements are fairly stated. So that materiality threshold is established, usually quantitatively to begin with, and we use 3% of either assets or revenue as that threshold. And then we also look at things if we have issues or we identify issues, then we look at those qualitatively as well. So there's a little bit of background there. Some of the significant areas we look at is the financial reporting and disclosures. There's a lot of disclosures that accompany the financial statements, and those disclosures provide context to the numbers, because you can't always understand what those numbers are without having some understanding of what's beneath those numbers. So that's what the disclosures do. It's a very critical part of understanding the financial statements. So that's a significant area that we spend a lot of time in as we look at the financial statements. Investment valuations, investments that, you have a large investment portfolio, and that portfolio is reported at fair value. And that means that the financial statements, the investments that you have need to be reported at their fair market value, not at, maybe what you purchase those investments for. And so there's an estimate component to reporting investments. And so depending on the market, those can be significant. State Bar doesn't invest in risky investments. And so that's typically not a big issue for governments, but nonetheless, it's a very large number. And so we need to look at those pretty closely. Accounts receivable and payable are significant because they're cutoff information. We're looking at things either that are due to State Bar or that State Bar owes as of December 31, but they may not have been paid or received yet. And so we need to make sure that those that cutoff information is reported correctly. You have 2 large mortgages on your properties, and so we need to look at those and make sure that those are reported appropriately. Pension and OPEB are very significant amounts and impacts. You have a large you have a large body of personnel, and those pensions are very expensive. And then finally, revenue recognition. We just want to make sure that the revenues that are collected by State Bar are reported in the appropriate period. And so those revenues earned in fiscal year 2021, in this case, need to make sure that those are complete and reported accurately. And one thing I will say that State Bar did get a large federal grant, and that federal grant's not going to be recognized this year. And you'd say, well, why? Because the grant is recognizes revenue as you earn it, as you're performing services. And so there's an eligibility criteria that needs to be met in order to recognize that revenue. So you'll see that next year, but you won't see that in this year's 2021 financial statements. And then finally, fraud. The purpose of the audit is not to find fraud. This isn't a forensic audit, but it's a financial audit, and we need to make sure that financial statements are fairly stated, which we talked about. And that includes whether or not there's misstatements in the financial statements caused by just error or fraud. And so we perform procedures to ensure that we've minimized the risk of there being a material misstatement, whether it's related to an error or fraud. And so we conduct procedures and do information gathering to that effort. And so just to summarize, the deliverables will be on the basic financial statements, and that's basically the general financial statements of State Bar. We'll also look at the statement of expenditures of mandatory membership fees to make sure that there isn't any non-compliance there. And then we look at the legal services trust program to make sure that it's receiving its appropriate revenues and it's spending it in accordance with the program requirements. And then finally, we're going to submit a letter to you, to the board of directors, just communicating the things that we discussed earlier are those required communications for the results of the audit. And so those 4 deliverables will be ready for your review, probably in time for the May meeting. The timing of the audit, we've already begun some of the audit, the interim work, the planning work. We're going to start in March, our final field work. We plan to be done by the April deadline, and then we collaborate year round. There's a couple pronouncements that'll be implemented this year, but they're really not going to be impactful. They're very small issues, but next year will be a big one. For governments, they have to implement the new lease standards. And so you do have 2 big properties. Those properties may have subleases. And so this will be something that management, the finance team will be working on probably this year after the audit to ensure that you're ready to implement for 2022. And with that, I will I'm available to answer any questions.
Are there any questions? Yes, Mr. Tony.
Thank you, Trustee Shelby. So yeah, I have a few questions. The first is, David, is your firm new to doing auditing for the State Bar, or is this something you've done in years past? I'm just trying to get a baseline here.
Yeah, so our firm has been doing the State Bar audit under the current contract. This is year number 4. So we've been doing it. We've done it for the past 3 years. 2021 will be our 4th year, and next year will be the last year under contract. And prior to that, we've audited State Bar. There was a break, but we were the auditors for 5 years preceding the last firm. So we had it for 5 years. Another firm had it for 5 years, and then we got it back 4 years ago.
Perfect. So I'm curious why this is a 2-year audit. And as opposed to an annual audit, just help me understand that. I was a little confused when I read that.
Yeah, where did you see that? Because I apologize. It's a single year audit. We're auditing just calendar year 2021.
It says you have requested we audit financial statements of the State Bar for years ended December 31, 2021 and 2020. It sounds like it's 2 years. I read that as 2 years. Maybe I misread it, but when I see 2 years written, I think it's 2 years. Maybe I'm confused.
Oh.
First sentence after the following represents our understanding of the services.
Okay. Yeah, it's a single year. We audited 2020. And so I apologize. Probably the financial statements are a 2-year presentation. And so in the financial statement.
Oh, of course. Okay, I got that. Like I said, I misunderstood what the word said. Now I understand it. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
There was an audit done in 2020. Perfect.
Absolutely, there was.
I wasn't on the committee then, so I have no clue.
Nope, okay. No, that's perfectly understandable.
Thank you. I'm interested in this revenue recognition of a federal grant because it was my understanding that under accrual accounting basis that grants are recognized as soon as you get the letter as revenue. And I was curious about what was different about the federal grant. Yeah.
So when you're talking about grants being recognized as revenue upon receipt, you're really talking about nonprofits, right? You're talking about
that's what I'm more familiar with. That's why I'm asking, so I can learn.
Yeah, so governments follow GASB. GASB is the body responsible for reporting for governments, and GASB has issued a lot of guidance around revenue. It's an important topic.
Thank you.
There's guidance specifically for non-exchange transactions, and that's what grants fall under, or financial assistance. It follows non-exchange transactions, and there's 4 types of non-exchange transactions to look at. And I won't bore you with all that detail, but when you have a grant or financial assistance that's provided where there's eligibility criteria to be met, you can't recognize it until you've met that eligibility criteria. So anytime the grant says, here's $10 million and you have to spend it on this, a lot of times they're expenditure driven or reimbursement based and expenditure driven. In this case, you may have even gotten the money up front in advance, because a lot of times under the CARES Act and the rescue plan funds, a lot of these funds are given up front. However, you still have to meet that eligibility criteria. And so until you do, you're going to only recognize that cash in an unearned revenue, which is a liability, until you've met that eligibility criteria. So as soon as you provide the service that qualifies under that grant, then you recognize the revenue with that service timeframe.
Okay, that was excellent response. Thank you very much. You've made it very clear, and I'm through with my questions. Thank you very much.
Mark, I'll just add really quick. We are starting to get multi-year grants. So typically we have gone 12 months, but now we're starting to see, one of our grants is going to go over for 5 years. So we have been spreading out the revenue accordingly.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions?
I was curious to know what the process is for doing the audit that is mentioned in your engagement letter of whether the State Bar is in compliance with Keller's prohibition on spending money on political activities. What is the process that you guys go through for that?
Yeah, so the process is in forgive me going off memory here, but what we do is we look at the funds where the membership fees go into. And State Bar has lots of funds. It's not just a big pool of activity, but there's, in governmental accounting, oftentimes you have funds and you separate activity into different buckets, if you will, if it's easier to remember it that way. But we look at where the membership fees go, and then we look at the expenditures, and we select a sample of expenditures, making sure that there isn't, political activity or other things that are not qualified to be spent with membership fees. And so the process is really focusing in on the spending side, evaluating what activity is being spent and ensuring that it doesn't, that it's in compliance with the Keller settlement. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the process is to evaluate the expenditures for the year. And then we do that on an annual basis.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I just want to say to David and Araceli, thank you for getting the materials out in advance. I think this is an excellent example of when we get to see things in advance, people come prepared with questions. And so I'm sorry. That being said, I'm sorry. That being said, we can adjourn the meeting. Can we get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Adjourn.
First by Tony.
Second.
Second by Chen. Do we need to take the roll?
I'm unclear, but Vanessa, I think we can just adjourn, the chair can just adjourn, correct?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.